Welcome to Redefining Medicine, an intimate and personalized program that illustrates a different side of the practice of medicine. Our in-depth conversations will focus on mentors and motivators who are consistently reshaping, redefining, and rediscovering the field of medical health care. I would like to welcome Dr. Kelly Olson. With a Master's in Science and a PhD in Pharmacology and Therapeutics, Dr. Kelly Olson serves as Associate Director of Clinical Affairs at Millennium Health. Dr. Olson is committed to integrative practices and protocols that focus on molecular neuro-pharmacology and clinical biology in the areas of mental illness, sleep, adrenal fatigue, and addictions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Olson.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, I know you have quite the diverse background, so why don't we just start at the beginning and why? This should be fun.
How much time do
we have all the time in the world. So why don't you start as to at the point where you had did you have an interest in the sciences as a child, or how did that begin?
That is an interesting question. I was always afraid of science. I wouldn't say that I didn't have an interest, but I didn't think I'd be very good at it for some rereason. And I'm not sure really where that came from.
Maybe it's the whole supermodel image.
No,
that you have.
no.
Okay.
It was something that it almost intimidated me. But here's why. I remember at a really young age being very curious, and I still am to this day, almost annoyingly so, my friends tell me. But I remember questioning everything, and I remember my mom kind of getting a little upset with me when I was really little, and my dad said, it's the only way she's going to learn is to ask questions. And although I don't remember that moment, I know my mom talked to me about it after, and she felt really bad because she didn't want to stifle anything, of course. But I'd always been curious, and to this day, it's probably exponentially so. But back then, I think that's what really kind of drew me into the sciences, even though I sort of pushed back and thought that wasn't for me. And I'm glad that I got into it because I absolutely love it. So it started pretty young with a lot of questions, and it just sort of blossomed from there.
So you went to school and you received your master's in exercise physiology? Is that
right.
where it started? Okay.
That's right. I would say it probably started a bit even before that. I did a bachelor's degree in sports medicine, so athletic therapy, and in Canada it's CATA is what the acronym is. And it really started there, where I started thinking that, hey, I could do this. I really love and enjoy doing this, and I could help people. And I was the first one out on the ice for a hockey game. If one of my players went down, it felt really good, to be able to get out there and help him. And then I worked with swimmers, and I worked with football players, and I thought, there's something to this medicine thing that I like. I really enjoy, being the first one there and the person that folks listen to for help. And I think that's where it started. And then when I finished, my mentor at the time, I said to him, what's next? Where do I go now? And he said, well, a couple things. Apply to different junior level hockey, teams, and work your way up to the NHL. And I thought, perfect, that's exactly what I want to do. Or, he said, go back to school and start to build your credibility, with the academic side, do some research, etc. And I thought, I'm going to go the former first and just see what I can do. And I got letter after letter, no thank you, no thank you, no thank you. And I was devastated because I thought I was going to be in the NHL someday as the trainer, It was a grandiose idea. So I changed course, and I went and I applied for graduate school, and I got in, and I loved it. So that credibility made the difference.
And then what sparked your interest in going into pharmacology and therapeutics?
It's the funniest story, twofold. I'll tell you the funny part first. So I was wandering around. I had finished my master's degree. I had moved to a brand new city thinking that, I'm going to start anew and I'll get a job and everything will be great. Well, it didn't come all that quickly. And so, I did what most people do, and I went shopping. I thought, well, that'll cure everything. And as I was walking around, I saw this kiosk, and it was for the University of Manitoba for Pharmacology and Therapeutics for their PhD program. And I thought, wow, I wonder if maybe that would be kind of interesting. And I knew nothing about it. I mean, I'm just coming off of sports medicine here. And I applied, and about, I would say, a month later, I got an acceptance letter. And I still didn't know anything about it. So I quickly studied up on it, and I thought, this is really cool. This is about the body and how the body reacts to things we put into it, and how reflexively how things, interact with our outward manifestations. And I thought, this could be really interesting. And so I would say 2 months later, I was preparing letters and what have you just to get into school, and got in no problem. And I thought, did they look at my transcripts, because this is amazing. And I never looked back. I have loved it from that moment forward. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. So.
To that point, I have a question. I read on your bio that you worked for the Canadian Customs Office.
You're right.
As an officer.
Yes,
so
I did.
Tell us about that, and when. Where did you find the time?
Well, it was between school.
Okay.
So in the summer, I was hired on as a student. The full officer, powers. I was a full Customs Border Patrol, and then I got hired on full time. And, I thought, I always joke that, of course, law enforcement, I look the part? Like, don't I look
maybe on
scary?
TV, right?
Yeah. So I did it for 7 years.
Amazing.
In between school, got on full time, as I mentioned, and then I loved it. There was something to be said about that adrenaline, about, again, saving your country sort of thing. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it, but it made me very cynical. It made me not trust what people were telling me. So when I did get into medicine, I had to really scramble to get rid of that attitude, so to speak, or maybe not attitude is the right way, but just way of viewing people. I was always very concerned, that someone was lying to me. And I was working in the addictionology, working with some doctors, and I had to train them to be able to not necessarily trust their patients per se, but to be able to therapeutically align with them, so that if they did find something suspect in, let's say, a urine tox screen, it wasn't that they were doing something nefarious automatically, but that maybe something else was going on. Maybe they were, but maybe something else was going on, and we need to start there first. But my law enforcement was like, no, they're doing something obviously bad. Like, they can't be doing anything good. So I had to really change my mindset to get back on track, more of that therapeutic alliance instead. So it was a good thing, showed me, taught me how to be courageous, how to be confident, but it also taught me how to be pretty cynical too when it came to trusting people.
And if this whole medicine thing didn't work out, you could always be a bouncer outside of some club and check fake IDs.
That's exactly right. So. And actually, it was funny because they did call me back. They called me back, I would say about halfway through my PhD.
Wow. Called
me back to full-time service. And I politely declined. I said that it's not where I want to be. So, and I'm thankful for that. So.
Okay, so that's quite a fascinating background. So once you finished your PhD, where did that take you? What did you do?
Well, interestingly enough, again, I couldn't find anything right away. I applied to all kinds of companies and pharmaceutical companies, thinking that I needed to get out of academia, get into more industry. I had a lot of student loans, as we're all very familiar with. But I was also very interested in industry. It was something I hadn't even stepped a toe in, let alone really understood what was happening. So I tried and tried and tried, much like my athletic therapy days, where I kept getting no, or no answer. And so I went into teaching. I taught at a high school, and I was terrible at it. I thought, why aren't you listening to me? There's good things we need to talk about. And you guys are talking about, Friday night dance or whatever. I thought, this is not for me. I can't do this. So one of my girlfriends, her husband was diagnosed with about 5 different mental illnesses. And I thought, something's not right here. If this person is basically sedated and not contributing to society and not getting better, something's wrong with that medical process. And he then was put into an institution because he had taken an axe and was going to chop up furniture, and he just kept hearing voices, etc. And my girlfriend, she's a nurse, and she said this is unacceptable, but she had to get him care. And so they ended up putting him in an institution, and the doctor there said, you might as well drop the papers because he's not going to be the same man you married. So drop the papers and get ready to move on. And she refused. She said, this is not what I signed up for on many levels, but I'm not leaving him. And so she found a place in Florida here that they talk about integrative medicine. And they talk about the person as a whole rather than treating the symptoms. And that really intrigued me because in academia, they don't necessarily teach that. I was very molecular, if you will. And so she found this doctor, and my friend's husband wouldn't jump on a plane. He kept hearing voices saying he was going to die if he went, anywhere near Florida, etc., to this doctor. And what finally happened was he finally just said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I don't care what I'm hearing or feeling. And about a year later, he started to get stable. He started to, again, they did a lot of testing, different tests than allopathic medicine. Nothing wrong with one or the other, but it just was appropriate for him. They found out that a lot of his chemistry was completely off, contributing significantly to his mental illness, and the fact that he was on as many medications as he had mental illness. And so he wasn't even thinking straight at that point, let alone, the voices that continued to plague him. That year it took for them to start to understand what was happening with his chemistry. And a few years later, again, painfully slow, but each moment he just got better and better and better. And I got to see it at the beginning. And about halfway through is when I graduated. And so the company that they worked with that provided the supplements and different things in the biotech industry, that was the company that I thought, I want to work for these guys because I saw the change, the positive change in this man. And so I jumped in my car. I called them. They said, no jobs. And I called them a week later. No jobs. And I thought, this is not going to stop me. I see the change in this man. I'm going to get in the car and drive down there. And so I drove from Ontario to Wisconsin. I got lost, I don't know how many times. I found the company. At the end of the day, I opened the door to walk in. Everyone was walking out. Everyone was done for the day. This really nice lady who was the office manager said, how can I help you? And I said, well, I'm looking for a job. And she said, well, you're in luck. The owner's walking down the hall, she said. And then she smiled at me and she slipped out the door. And the owner said, what's your business here? And I said, well, I'm looking for a job, and I think I can really help. And he looked at me and he said, what's your credentials? And he was very stoic, and I thought, oh, great, what have I done? And I told him, and he looked at me, he opened the door wide, and he said, come on in.
Wow.
And so I walked in, I checked out the lab, they showed me everything, and about a month later, my visa was in place, and I was working in the industry that I knew was one that I wanted to stay in. So that was a long story, but
that's an incredibly fascinating story.
That's what happened.
It's actually quite inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
So how long did you spend with that company?
4.5 years as a director of research and development, and it was frustrating and fascinating all at the same time. It's hard to explain, but it was the most amazing experience.
In what way?
To learn, well, good question. To learn how the body functions in conjunction with the molecular side. So how behaviorally, how emotionally, how physically do we respond, react, whatever, to the molecular side of what's happening in our bodies. I remember my very first talk was in New York City, And I didn't know, I'd never been to New York. I didn't know what the doctors were like there. I knew nothing about New York. And it was a talk on sleep medicine, and my plane got in 2 hours before I had to start getting ready for my seminar. So talk about living what I was preaching that day. But I remember talking and thinking, why aren't people like nodding or responding or sitting back and, maybe angry, showing anything, any response? And what I found was that I talked about the molecular side of medicine, and honestly, nobody cared. It was fascinating to me as a scientist, but it meant nothing to the clinician who couldn't make the connection between the cell and the person. And from that moment on, I vowed I would never ever be that, ivory tower kind of speaker where I only talked about that molecular side and didn't make the connection. So that was sort of really the inception of how I got into more of that integrative space rather than just focusing on the cell. So it served me well, because then people started asking questions instead of these blank looks.
So how did you first come to learn of A4M?
So interestingly enough, with that company that I worked for, with biotech, it was funny because they had speakers that had sent in, abstracts that wanted to speak at A4M, and I thought, what is A4M? I mean, we just didn't talk about that in molecular biology. And so they said, well, Kelly, why don't you go ahead and you put an abstract in? I said, I don't even know first of all, what would I say? And secondly, what is this company or this organization? And so I went online and I checked it out, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. They're doing some really interesting things. And so I thought, well, let's talk about, I think it was adrenal fatigue at the time. Let's talk about that and how it corresponds with different circuits in the brain, because everybody thinks it's more on the top of the kidneys. And so I sent in an abstract, and you know what? I got accepted. And that was my first foray into speaking with A4M, and that was probably, I think, about 8 years ago now. And I've spoke with A4M now for a number of conferences, and I love it. I love it because it's so forward-thinking and whole-body medicine, and I love that.
So tomorrow you'll be speaking on sleep.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well, some people have said, why don't you talk to Kelly, because she's an expert in sleep. And I laugh because I don't think anybody is an expert in sleep. I don't know if we ever could be an expert in sleep. I'm certainly the first one to stand up and say that's not me. But I love it. I have a passion for it because it's something that seems to manifest in so many different situations. In health even. We're not even talking about disease states. Sometimes in health, if you get a little bit too stressed out, or you've got a wedding that's coming up, so it doesn't have to be bad stress, it can be good stress. Sleep issues can ensue. And so I've always had a passion to understand what happens in the brain with sleep. And so that's what really launched me into sort of focusing more, I guess you could say, in that realm. But by no means, tomorrow is going to be fun and exciting, and there'll be hopefully a lot of things that we'll be sharing and learning as a group. But I'd be remiss if I said I was even remotely close to being an expert in that field, because there's just so much to it.
So if you could impart one message to the clinicians you're speaking with tomorrow, the most important thing that they would leave the room and implement into their practice on Monday morning, what would that be?
Twofold, I would say. I was thinking about it on the plane as well here, and I thought, what is it that I can contribute to what a clinician sees every day? Because it's not just sleep, and I say that very cautiously. Sleep usually, or impaired sleep, or etc., usually is comorbid. I mean, we always talk about the chicken and the egg, right? Which came first, sleep or the disease state? So when the flight attendants were talking about the oxygen, the masks that come down from the ceiling, and they said, put your mask on before assisting others, I got thinking that that's very much how we should be approaching medicine. And if we're talking about sleep, we should be sleeping as people that are providing care to our patients. if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're certainly not at our best to be able to be helping our patients. So I would say, start to look at your own situation and really start taking care, or be mindful of your triggers, things that you're not sleeping, that's causing you not to sleep. So take care of you. So that's maybe a little bit more on the high level side, but I really believe in that. I think you should take care of yourself too. But now to apply it on those Monday morning clinicals, as I call them, I think one thing that I hope folks take away is that when they look at a person who one of the symptoms is insomnia or fragmented sleep, or, I can't get to sleep, take a step back and don't lose your courage. And what I mean by that is look at that person from all angles. Is it a hormonal issue? Is there low-grade inflammation that maybe has gone unaddressed? Is it something like a garbage truck comes through every morning at 5 a.m. and it's that backup noise that potentially is disrupting their sleep? I mean, look at a person from all angles rather than just the symptomology, because I think we'd be very surprised at the end of the day how many people are affected by disordered sleep by so many other things. And it can be overwhelming, but start to just piece your way through it, and no question or no thought is juvenile. I mean, it could be as simple as magnesium, or it could be as complicated as major depressive disorder and underlying inflammation.
Or a snoring husband.
Or a snoring husband. That's right. That's
in
an
my
easy
case,
fix.
anyway. What is the most common reason that you find
for dysfunctional sleep? I would say, partners really do contribute. There's no question. It really leads to even separate bedrooms a lot of times, because that snoring isn't always taken care of. So I would say a good portion of it has to do with the physical, the snoring and that sort of thing. But I also got to say, and this is definitely another passion of mine, but I would say a lot of it has to do with our diet, that low-grade inflammatory situation that we find ourselves in. Nobody's really looking at that as perhaps specifically as they should. We take it for granted that we're eating a butter croissant for breakfast, thinking that, at least we're having breakfast, but yet what is that doing to our bodies come time to sleep? Adding a little more sugar to the system, what's that doing? So I would say it's probably more twofold, my opinion. One would be, of course, the physical with the snoring, etc. But the other one, I really think we need to start looking at more at nutrition and inflammation as a big contributor.
So you've spent a few years as the Director of Clinical Research and Development at Sleep Image, and you've moved on.
Yes.
So what is your new role in the new company?
So I am the Associate Director of Clinical Affairs, and as part of my job, I go around and do a lot of training, giving lectures, etc., to my colleagues on how to get their patients well faster. So it's more encompassing now than focusing simply on sleep. I get to take sleep and really insert that into things like addiction, pain, mental illness, etc. So I've got more of a kind of a global view now, and it's amazing when I tell people, I've done work in sleep medicine, instantly they want to know more. They've got, folks that are going through detox that are not sleeping. They absolutely cannot sleep. Well, what do I do? Or, someone that is in absolute pain from some kind of spine surgery. Well, I can't get them sleeping. Do you have suggestions? So it's amazing how it comes back around no matter what area of medicine you're in.
And you still see patients?
I do a lot of consulting still, and laboratory interpretations and different things. Kind of keeps me in the background, which I like, in that research capacity, but I also get to have that touch point with patients where maybe I can make a bit of a difference.
So if you weren't doing what you're doing, what do you think you'd be doing?
Somebody asked me the question the other day. Two things. It's always two things. One would
besides
be...
your supermodel career.
Which totally worked out for me in the past. One thing I'd love to do is I'd love to finish my MD training so I could do like Doctors Without Borders and different things. So I could go and instead of being the one up on stage and training and that sort of thing, I can actually get in there with my two hands and I could help and, you know, maybe make a difference that way. So part of me is thinking, well, maybe that's still in the cards. Maybe that's something I could do. And if not, I'd be on stage singing country music. So,
do you care to give us a sample? Right.
Yeah, that's right.
We might have a guitar here somewhere. Seriously, though, what was my next question? I had it on the tip of my tongue before you totally floored me with that country music thing.
No one expects the country music thing.
Right, no,
like,
I did
what?
not. I really didn't expect that one. So you mentioned that you'd love to potentially get your MD. Mm-hmm. Do you think that you might find it frustrating, though, because of how they teach in medical schools today? I know that, you know, more and more institutions are implementing an integrative approach, but do you think that you would, you know, wind up questioning what you're being taught?
That is a fantastic question. In fact, I brought that up. One of my mentors, I have two psychiatrists who have sort of brought me up through the ranks, if you will, in understanding mental health. And both of them have said to me, you know, what about finishing up the MD? What about going, you know, and getting that done? And honestly, I gotta say that in what I see them, and they're integrative, they're very not allopathic, they're very much that sort of bringing in functional and integrative medicine into the mix. And honestly, I don't know if that's something that would be as fulfilling as something like what I'm doing right now, where I can kind of take a step back. I've got that research background. I've got the brain that kind of always goes toward, you know, what it means to really dig down deep and research something. I don't know, in 15-minute, you know, patient consults, if that was something that would be good for who I am or my personality. So part of me questions that. If I could get an hour with everybody, which is a utopia, maybe. But I don't think with the way medicine is right now, where everybody's so taxed for time, I just don't know if it would be as fulfilling for my personality. You know, my hardcore training, we took pharmacology, pharmacy, you know, all of the processes behind what happens with these drugs, how they're manufactured, how they come to be, how we distribute them, and why. And I get it, I understand it, and I like it. But for so long, it has been the be-all and end-all for medicine. And although there is a spot for it, it's a spot. It's not the entire workup of what that person needs to get them healthy again, or at least stable and functioning. I think the frustration would be real because a lot of it would be focused on pharmaceuticals. And let's just give a pill for this and a pill for that. That is not something that I think is responsible. And again, that's the scientist in me saying it. And what I mean by that is responsible medicine, where you're taking that person as a whole being. And we're not talking crystals here and different things, or, you know, I call that frou-frou science, and I'll probably get in trouble for that. But I'm talking about hardcore researched processes and protocols that potentially can help people as a whole person, rather than here's your pill, here's your prescription, because that'll only move the ball so far down the field. The rest of it has to be taken care of with that more integrative approach. I just believe that.
Where do you see your role in that regard? I
see it definitely on the research side. Again, that's where I feel comfortable. My microscope is home. I love that. I see me being someone who potentially champions that side of contributing to clinicians that are out there, that are in the trenches, that are working with these patients, that are frustrated because They don't know where to go. And not only that, they don't have time. If they had the time, they'd figure it out. They are smart as they come. But without that time, they don't always have the opportunity to really get in there and dig into what that patient needs. And maybe that's where I come into play. Maybe that's where my skills could potentially be utilized the most.
What do you see yourself doing in 5 to 10 years?
I may be finishing my MD. No.
Performing at the Country Music Awards.
That's right, of course,
right.
with Blake Shelton at my side. Probably can't say that name, but oh well. I think it's a really good question. I think part of what I would like to see is being able to provide maybe a service, if you will. I don't really like that word, but being able to provide clinicians a place to go for help. So whether that be hanging a shingle out, whether that be being a consultant and just being available, but somewhere where the work that I've put into understanding the processes in the brain and the neurocircuitry, etc., somewhere where I could have a platform to share it. You know, and that when they're that busy, you know, dealing with these patients, they can easily come to me and say, "Hey, I don't understand this. Can you give me some insight on this pathway?" Or what do you think of this patient? And I could be there and be that resource for them. And secondarily, I also picture potentially, again, being part of an organization like A4M and really pushing that integrative approach forward, being part of the voice. You know, and I don't ever like to be political, but we almost have to get that way in order to get people treated appropriately. So, you know, perhaps there's that in the future as well, where, you know, I'm more of a voice for the research side of integrative medicine.
What do you find has been the most rewarding part of the journey that you've been on?
Okay, great question. I would say that, I mean, that's definitely one for thought. It shouldn't be answered, you know, really quickly because there's so much to it. But the first thing that comes to mind would be, I remember working with a nurse in Philadelphia area, and it was his son that had a number of mental illnesses as well, very similar to my previous story. And the dad, the nurse, was at his wit's end, and he said, "I have absolutely nowhere else to go. I've taken him to the finest. I've taken him to, you know, here and there, and I've also imparted the medical knowledge that I have, you know, and I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, let's work together. Let's figure this out. We will figure this out." And I would say about 6 months into it, we started to see some changes. Again, this time it was me that was part of the team instead of really watching from the outside. And I started to see some changes. Now we had setbacks, but I started to see a lot of positive changes, and I thought, wow, this is working and it's tangible. There is much more to this than interest. And as things progressed, you know what, that young man has graduated university. He was close to the top in his class. He's now gainfully employed. You know, his dad swears that without me, this wouldn't have been possible. Now, I don't believe that. I think he's being very kind, but I believe in the contribution that some of those pathways, some of those processes that I learned and that I was able to glean from these medical textbooks and talking with other providers and putting the story together, I believe that I contributed to the health of this young man. And that, to me, is one of the greatest accomplishments, not the papers on the wall and, you know, all that. That's all well and good. But when you can turn the ship around, that's an amazing feeling when someone starts to respond and starts to, you know, love life again. That's huge. That would be probably one of the greatest moments, is seeing patients get well instead of just talking about it, but actually seeing them get well.
It's got to be incredibly gratifying, but also what an extraordinary responsibility on your shoulders.
Yes. Yes. Now, I can't even imagine what a surgeon goes through. Someone asked me when I say the brain is my specialty, oh, so you're a brain surgeon? And I say, not even close. And I'll say, instead of getting into details, I'll just tell them my hands weren't steady enough to be a surgeon. But talk about responsibility. When I look at it from my perspective, I always look at myself as part of the team. And that if the team fails, well, we all do, and we go back to the drawing board. You know, if we're able to do that, we go back to the drawing board. But personally, at night, there are times when I'm done for the day, and I just think, how in the world are we going to help this person? And that's one of the greatest challenges that I see in medicine. Maybe it's just me. I kind of don't think so.
I don't think it's just you.
But it definitely feels very humbling. And you realize your own mortality when there are times where you cannot help somebody, or you've only taken it so far, and then now it's beyond, you know, your reach, and now it's in the hands of someone else. If you start looking at it with limitations, you start to really allow that the weight of that responsibility to hang on your shoulders. So I try to push that back, and I try to just to remember that I'm part of a team. And that hopefully I'm a good part of the team.
How do you cope with patients that are not compliant with the protocols that you suggest either to their clinician or to the patient directly?
When they don't follow protocol, it almost feels like they don't necessarily believe in you. And that can be a tough one to kind of rectify or reconcile, you know, where you think, I know this is going to work, just trust me. And they've heard it all. Some of them are just doing it because that's who they are, but some of them are so frustrated themselves that, you know, they're not going to necessarily listen. It is frustrating when folks don't follow protocol, because how do you know that what you're doing is actually helping if you've got nothing to measure it by? So I find that to be challenging, for sure, sometimes.
And it has to be even that much more critical when you're dealing with the brain.
Right, it is. And I'm finding too, and this is something that I'm sure psychiatrists or anybody else who are really focused on the functioning of the brain, what they deal with as well, is that those protocols, oftentimes we still are shooting in the dark. Functional MRIs, you name it, there's been a number of advances that have been amazing, but we still oftentimes are kind of feeling our way around. When patients go off protocol or don't follow it, or they're not taking their medications as appropriate or something, you might as well push a string up the hill, because you're not going to be able to help them to your best abilities, and certainly not to be able to retain their trust and their faith in the fact that you can help them. So I think that is probably one of the most critical, frustrating pieces to medicine, is when they're not working with you.
So let's talk about you a little bit and your personal life. How many hours a night do you sleep?
There are times where I cycle through where it's really busy and I might get 5 hours, but I operate optimally on 7. There's no question. It's not often that I get it in consecutive nights, but that's what I shoot for.
Did you ever have any disturbances in your life that caused you to inspire you to study sleep?
I think we all do if we sort of step back and think about it a little bit. Mine was the puzzle. It's always been the curiosity and the puzzle. When someone presents with a disorder of some kind, or maybe even comorbid disorders, sleep is almost always there, and there's a reason for it, and we still don't know exactly what it is. I studied Alzheimer's disease for 5 years in academia, cognitive dysfunction, MS, diabetes, Alzheimer's. And we've been studying Alzheimer's since 1906. At least that's where we've really recorded our findings. We are still, however long it's been now, we are still at a point where we're not able to stop it. And to me, that absolutely drives me crazy, that even cancer, we're still at a point where there's many cancers that go untreated, and it's frustrating as well. But why are we at a point where we've got so much knowledge, but yet we cannot seem to remedy or stop or change course on certain disorders? And sleep is one of them. It can be so insidious. It can be here and it can be gone, and then it's back again, and we still can't get our arms around it. And I think it's the hard cases like that draw me the most. Definitely the most frustrating, but maybe the most impactful someday. So I think that's probably why sleep has been such a draw for me.
It hasn't kept you up at night thinking about it?
Well, as a matter of fact, it has.
I'm sure it has. So what do you do in your spare time when you're not aspiring to be a country music artist or looking in your microscope?
Well, that does keep me busy, for sure. I love to hike. I live in Denver. Those Rocky Mountains are so, I mean, they call your name every time you look out the window. So I do a lot of hiking just to stay active, because that's the other thing to all of this. We can sit behind our microscopes, or we can sit and deal with patients, and we can do all this. But again, to my point of taking care of ourselves, get out there, get the blood flowing, get oxygen going through your system. Do things that make you happy, because ultimately that's going to give you that much more strength and courage and drive to help other people. So I do a lot of hiking. I do a lot of painting. I love spending time with, I've got 2 nieces and a nephew who I'm trying to be the greatest auntie on the planet. And I spend a lot of time with my family. So try to keep it as well-rounded as possible, but sometimes, we get busy and you kind of forget that I haven't had my running shoes on for a couple days, so try to keep a good balance.
That's a great way to end it, I think. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And good luck tomorrow.
Thank you.
I'm sure it'll be fascinating, and no one will fall asleep during the lecture.
I sure hope not. Please, I hope not. Thanks for your time, though. This was wonderful. Thank you.